All right, good evening. Tonight, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more freewheeling. I've been a student of history since I was younger, and I follow a lot of history, and I thought that there was a lot of people that I know had questions about how we got from Israel from ancient times to today, and with all the struggles that's going on in Israel, the college protests last year. So I just put together a little something that's biblically based, as we are Bible believers, but it covers a lot of, it's very heavy on the history. Now just remember there's 6,000 years of history that I had to condense into 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask some questions, try to get people involved, and if you have any questions, just feel free to ask me, because some things that I might think people know, they may not know, because like I spent a couple hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours going through history from Abraham to today, and that's what the outline I call it. It's from Abraham to Hamas, Hamas is the terrorist organization that's now quite in the news. So just to start off, I'm going to ask anybody in the room, of our 50 states, what state is the closest to physical and population size of Israel? Did anybody know?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Could you hand those out, my assistant?
Yeah.
So yes, I thought that was quite amazing that New Jersey, which is a population of 9.3 million, and Israel has a population of 9.3 million, and the total square miles of New Jersey is 8.722, and of Israel it's 8,469 square miles. So the first cutout you have is Israel superimposed next to New Jersey, so you can see how close they are in shape. And it is quite amazing that since we are residents of New Jersey, that Israel is the closest. New Jersey is the closest to Israel's size. So I want you to think about something when you think about Israel and you think about the United States, specifically New Jersey. Now imagine that New Jersey was its own separate country. And to the north, we weren't friendly with any of the surrounding countries. So New York would be its own country, and they would shell and attack northern New Jersey. You'd probably have to move all the people about 30 miles south of North Jersey. So that would probably be getting closer to Homedale, a little bit above Tom's River. And then in the south, you would have people from Delaware coming across the river attacking New Jersey. And then you would have Pennsylvania, a very large mass to its west, sitting there and just have guns and tanks pointed at New Jersey. And how would we feel as New Jerseyans that we lived like that? But in Israel, that's their everyday life. They're surrounded three sides by countries that do not want them to exist, that aren't very friendly to them. So I just hope that puts that in perspective of the little nation of Israel, why it is so important biblically, and also why it is so much in the news since I've been a young man right up to today, and we always have news.
I just wanted to say, important to note, that this isn't all the land that the Lord had given them. This is just what they possess now, but in Scripture, it was a broader area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yes. So let's go back to 2166 BC. In the Bible, this is called the Age of Patriarchs, and it's 500 years before Moses. And in the city and the area of Ur, lives a man, and his name at that time is Abram. Now, we don't have any record, really historical record of where Ur was located, but they believe it is somewhere in present Iraq. So if you go up to the northeast of Israel, there would be a little area that was called Ur, and that was in Mesopotamia. I don't know if anybody knows, that's like the cradle of civilization, that they say the Euphrates River is right there, and a lot of civilization, they believe, started there. So if you would all turn to Genesis 26, 1 through 5, and I will just read it for you. And this is like Kirk said, this is the start of the land that promising the land to Abram, which eventually made it to where we are today. So, verse 1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came, and Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land, and the Lord appeared unto Abram, and said unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord, which appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So does anyone know where Canaan would be today? John, you were just ready to raise your hand. Where would Canaan be today? Well, we're talking about a specific area of the world. What country would be in Canaan today? Anybody?
Not in Israel.
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 Israel would be in that area. There was, like Kirk said, there's a larger geographical area,
Yes.
but Israel would be in Canaan. And it's called the Promised Land for a reason, because God promised it to Abram, and Abram went there with faith with God. God has spoken to him, packed up, he had quite a few possessions, and at that point his name was Abram, and his wife's name was Sarai, which is Sarai. So just remember that for later. So the promised land where he went also encompasses now Jordan and Syria. It's quite a wide area. So if you go to your second, it's called the genealogy of Abram.
Oh, I like this map.
So could somebody read Genesis 17 verse 19 for me?
Genesis what?
Chapter 17 verse 19, please.
And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him.
Thank you, Kelly. So you see that God expressly said that Abram and Sarah would be the father of the seed, not Abram and anybody else. So at that point, God gets ready to change Abram's name to Abraham. And Abram means noble father, but Abraham means father of many. And Sarai, which meant princess, becomes Sarah, which is mother of nations. So you can see that God's taken them from single parenthood to a great parenthood over many people. So God's already moving, and Abram was faithful to God. He packed up everything he had, went to a promised land, and he settled there. Now there's another son born to Abram, and what's that other son's name? Ishmael. So if you go to the second, which is the genealogy of Abraham, you can see that you have Abraham, and he had 3 wives. Sarah, which was the father of Isaac. You have Hagar, which is the father of Ishmael. And then after Sarah died, now you got to remember, Abraham was over 100 years old when he had Isaac. But he even had children. You can see many children that's documented after Sarah died. So Keturah was his second wife after Sarah left this earth. So Abraham was quite a healthy gentleman, even into his hundreds. So Ishmael was born, and he was born, who was his mother? Does anybody know? Hagar. And why did that happen? Because God already said that Sarah is going to be the mother of the nations, but
Of course, she got impatient and couldn't wait.
that's
Sarah
exactly
did.
what I wrote, impatience.
Lack of faith.
Lack of faith.
Didn't wanna wait on the Lord.
Didn't want to wait on the Lord, exactly. They actually laughed. He actually laughed when God told him this, because he was 100. Sarah was already declared barren, and they laughed, and they didn't wait for God's promise. So this is the start of the dysfunctional family, which is really what, when you look at what happened, they became a dysfunctional family because Abram didn't wait, and he had relations with Hagar, and Ishmael was born.
Right.
So that was okay with everybody until the Lord blessed Sarah, and she got pregnant, and she had Isaac. And what happened when Isaac was born? Sarah got jealous, because now his oldest heir is Ishmael. Excuse me. His oldest heir is Ishmael, and by tradition, the oldest child would get the inheritance. Even though that wasn't his wife, it would cause some problems. So Sarah got a little upset that there was Ishmael when she had Isaac. So in Genesis 17:20, if you'd like to turn to there, that's Genesis 17:20. This is referencing Ishmael. And that's Genesis 17:20. Now God's a just God, and he's a merciful God. And he says, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation." Now God, being a merciful God, he knew that this was not Ishmael's fault, that he didn't do anything wrong. It was the impatience, the lack of faith of Sarah and Abram. So he was very kind to Ishmael. But at 13, Ishmael was cast out of Abraham's house. In our Bible, it says he sent Hagar and Ishmael away. Now, when I looked up the Islamic version, because they call Abraham father as well. They call him Father Abraham. So the three religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they're called the Abrahamic religions. So in Islam, they believe that Ishmael, with his mother Hagar and Abraham, went west. And they founded the city of Mecca, which is a holy city in Islam. And then Abraham then leaves them, returns to his home in the promised land, into Canaan, and he says he's leaving them in God's hands. Now, if you go to the lineage that the Islamic people, they believe that Muhammad, their prophet, is considered a direct descendant of Ishmael. And if you go back to the genealogy piece of paper, you can see that there's Isaac there, and then there's Abraham, and then Ishmael, and then as Ishmael goes down, if you follow the line, it says chiefs of Edom. But you also look on the other side where Isaac had two sons, which we'll get to in a minute. Esau, not part of the lineage of the Jews, but he basically goes back and joins the line that came from Ishmael to form the Arab people. So there was a lot of family issues going on here, but you can see how Abraham is recognized by both Muslims and Jews, and then therefore Christians, as the father of their both religions. So the family drama begins, and so Isaac had to be born of both Abraham and Sarah. So he was the heir to all of God's promises to Abram. So it had to be a child from Sarah and Abraham. that had the promises of building the nations. It couldn't be a son of Hagar or anyone else. And as you see in the genealogy, only Isaac was born to Sarah and Abram. So he was very special, and he was the father of Judaism. So then then Isaac had two sons, and this Esau and Jacob. Now, what's interesting about the birth order of Esau and Jacob? Anybody know who of them they were twins?
They were twins. But
Who was
Jacob-
born first? Carol?
Jacob was supposed to be born first.
Well, who was born first though?
Esau.
Esau was born first.
Yeah.
So he would have been the rightful heir to all that Isaac had. But anybody know, any of the young people, Gus or anybody, how did Jacob become the heir to Esau, over Esau to Isaac's life?
Because Esau wanted soup.
What?
Because Esau wanted soup.
Yes.
It's stew.
Very good. He sold his birthright for a pot of stew or soup or whatever. So you can see that at that point, Jacob became Isaac's heir, and he continues on in the genealogy sheet as the father of the Jewish nation. And the descendants of Esau go down. You have Adar, Arabimah, and Malalath, and they rejoin the other people in the area to become the descendants and the heirs of Islam. So now if you're going to go, can you go to the next one, which is the division of the land by Joshua. So Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Jacob got a new name, and his new name was Israel. And what happened that he was renamed Israel?
He wrestled with God.
Thank you. Yes, he wrestled with God.
Yeah.
And Israel means one who wrestles with God. There's a couple different definitions, but that's the one I went with. And one who wrestles with God was basically, they're all basically the same, but some of the language is a little more flowing. It depends on which commentary you pick up. So since he became named Israel, his 12 sons became Israelites. So that's the first time we hear of Israelites in the Bible. So what happened to Joseph? And we all know he was sold into slavery, and he became a second in command really in Egypt. And then Joseph welcomed his brothers and his into the kingdom, and his father as well. And if Joseph was very powerful, he was very favorable to his brothers and his father, and the Israelites in Egypt quickly multiplied. And as time went by, there were more and more Israelites, and a new Pharaoh came along, and he didn't like the fact that there were so many Israelites. They were in the millions at this point. And he was worried that there would be a rebellion, so he had to clamp down on the Israelites, and he basically forced them into slavery, into servitude. So they became second-class citizens in Egypt. At that point, before that, the descendants of Joseph, and they were good managers, intellectual. They allowed a lot of the Jews to be in positions of power, to run things, to make sure the city ran well. They respected the Israelites' talent for that. But then after this one Pharaoh, it doesn't say the name, I didn't research it farther, but he didn't know Joseph, he didn't know their history, and he was worried about all these Jews, which were definitely different. They behaved differently than the Egyptians. That at some point they could rebel and take away Egypt's predominance in the land. So this new Pharaoh took over the country, pushed the Israelites to servitude, and this opened the door for who? Who was the next great Jew that came along once the Israelites were in slavery? Anybody? Moses. So Moses comes into the scene, and Moses calls the Exodus is when Moses led the Jews into the promised land. So now the Jews are going back to the land that God had given to Abraham. And we all know they went 40 years in the desert, and we know the story. And then we get to story of Joshua. Now, when Joshua came to Canaan, I looked up, there were a lot of different people. And remember, back then they weren't countries. They were more tribal areas. They were people that identified. So I got a little list of the people that were in the area when the Jews came back. Now the Jews are over a million, maybe several million strong. They had the Kenites were there, the Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, which is a different one, was began with a C, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And there's a lot of people in the land, but Bible does not mention Palestinians. It's not a people at that point. So it's very important to remember that this land was given to the Jews. The Jews came back, and it wasn't claimed by anyone. It was basically nomadic people, shepherds. They really didn't have countries. They would have a city, it would spring up, or it might be a city of just tents. Some of them were walled fortresses, but it was nothing cemented there. They would come and go, and all of a sudden you have this mass of Israelites led by Joshua, and they conquered the land. And now we go to the word Palestine. It's not Arab or Middle Eastern in origin. There's a lot of different information on the history of where it came from. But they believe the most viable I saw, it dates back 1,900 years ago and is derived from a people called the Philistines. Now the Philistines, well, who was the most famous Philistine that we know of? Zach?
Zachariah.
Nope. Zach, do you know the most famous Philistine? He was a big dude. Goliath, right. So Goliath
Smart kids back there.
Goliath was the biggest Philistine. And they said the Philistines came from either Greek or Aramaic, and it went from Philistia to Palestia and then to Palestine. It's unclear from what I read whether there was a lot of languages in that area. You had Greek coming from the north, you had Arabic, you had languages from a lot of these tribes spoke their own languages. So you had a lot of different languages mixing and melding to make the words that we know today. And one of the probably major one in the area that lasted the longer was Greek. So then the Philistine people, not the Palestinians now, but the Philistine people, they died out in the 6th century BC. After that, you really don't hear about the Philistines. They could have become the Phoenicians. If anyone knows about Roman history, they battled the Carthage, and they could have become those people, seafaring people. But there was a lot of changes, a lot of intermingling, a lot of growing. But the consistent people in the area were the Jews, was the Israelites. But the name Palestine was still around, it was still used, and the name associated with them, it didn't die out. The Romans, after a rebellion by the Jews in what was called Judea, in a fit of spite, they reapplied the term Palestine to the land of Israel. They defeated this uprising, and in order to erase association between the land, and they knew how important the land was to the Jews in that area, but now they said, well, this land is now Roman land. We're not going to call it Judea. We're going to call it Palestine. So that's the first time when it became, under the Romans, the land of Palestine. So now we're going to jump ahead, because the history here of the Jews and the land, and there's a lot of centuries. We're going to move a little bit further. There's a time frame where it's called the Jewish exile. And that's the dispersion of Israelites and Jews out of their ancient ancestral homeland and their subsequent settlement in other parts of the globe. Now, there was a lot of instances where the Jews were spread out in many different areas. I mean, we all know they were taken captive and went to Assyria. They went to Babylon. The Romans spread out a lot of Jews. And you could see if everybody has their Bible in the back, they have the journeys of Paul. Paul went to visit Jews in Rome, in what's modern-day Turkey, in Asia, in Greece. And so Jews spread out all over the place, especially with Roman persecution. as any people were when you're being persecuted. You know, the pilgrims came from England to America. A lot of Jews left the promised land, the Canaan, and they moved to other places. So they spread out all over the known world at that time, and we can see that. So most of the things, a lot of things that make people move are wars. So does anybody know what the Crusades were?
But the Christian crusades?
Yep, the Christian Crusades. They were battles between Christians
Muslims.
against Muslims over, and what was the focal city that they battled over?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, thank you.
Jerusalem.
So during that, the first crusade was won by the Christians, and they took Jerusalem. And the first thing they did was sell Jews and Muslims into slavery. It was very common back then when you won a battle, everyone that you won was your slaves, you do with as you want. So they sent Jews and Muslims back into Europe, where the Crusades were, around France, Germany, was the Holy Roman Empire. So they sent them back there. A lot of Jews didn't want to be in the middle of a war. They moved to North Africa, so there were settlements there. So that was the first time that when the Christians won of Jerusalem. So the next time they battled, the Muslims won. And they took over Jerusalem, and they were not very favorable to Jews to begin with. And they called it the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for many centuries, and more Jews left then because they had lost their freedoms under the Romans, they had lost their freedoms under the Crusades, and now they had a Muslim overlord. And at that point, they were Muslims during the Crusades. The Arab people had followed Muhammad, and they were Muslims. So they were not very favorable to basically their cousins, who were both recognized Abram as their founding father, but there was a lot of contention, so even more Jews left. Just to give you, what year was America founded? John, what year were we founded? 17 what?
76?
Yes, very good. In 10 years before that, in 1764, there were 750,000 Jews in the Polish area of what is Poland now. They had left there, and the total Jews they estimate in the world was only 1.7 million. So half of the Jewish people in the world were living in Europe. And that's why you had a lot of Jews in Poland and Germany, and they had set up their own little areas. A lot were in Russia, Ukraine. So it's kind of hard to believe that back then, you think that all the Jews were still in the Mideast, but Europe had the most Jews of any place in the world. Right now, what country has the most Jewish people living in it? Anybody know?
Israel.
What's the second country?
Iran.
Nope.
Let's
A
see.
little
United
closer to
States.
home.
Jerusalem.
America.
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 Yep. There's first is Israel, then second is America. So we have a lot of Jewish brothers and sisters here in America. So Ottoman Empire, which is now present-day Turkey, joins Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I. So the Ottoman Empire throws their lot in with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and what happens to them? They were called the Axis. What happens to them in World War I? They win or lose?
They lost.
They lost.
They lost.
So what happens when you lose a war? The other countries come in and say, we want this area, we want this area. They start carving up your empire. Ottoman Empire had lots of land. They were a little backwards militarily, so they got defeated. And so that land, so Britain comes in as one of the winners in World War I, and they say, we're going to take over this land. Now, there wasn't any known oil or anything there. They didn't really know what it was good for, but Britain liked to own land. They owned America, they owned India, and now they wanted to own what is basically Palestine. And they call it the Palestine Mandate. And again, this consisted of Israel, Jordan, and Syria. So that area there, which wasn't Israel at the time, Jordan wasn't there yet, and Syria wasn't there yet. It was called the Palestine Mandate. So one of the blessings of all the Jews being spread out all over the world is that, like in old Egypt, they rose to power. They had a lot of influence. A lot of the rich people in America were of Jewish descent. A lot of people in politics. I mean, Britain had a prime minister, I can't remember his name, but in the 1800s they had a prime minister who was Jewish. They had a lot of power and a lot of influence, and they pushed to have a Jewish homeland restored. And they had the influence to do that. So at that point in 1922, since England owned almost at least half the world, but they also owned over the Palestine Mandate, they called it the Balfour Declaration, and it called for a Jewish state in Palestine. Well, this went over well with all the Jewish, but it didn't go over very well with the Arabs that were in the area. They didn't want the Jews back. They didn't want the Jews in the area, but there were more Jews in power throughout the world than there were Arabic people, and so Britain started looking at making a Jewish home state. And an interesting fact is one of the places they did that Britain also owned was Uganda, right in the middle of Africa. They had suggested that they would have Uganda and give a portion of that to the Jewish people. Well, the Jewish people said, no, we want the land that God promised us with Abraham, so we want to go back to Canaan, which is now the Palestine Mandate. So after this is all going on, there's all this discussions about a Jewish homeland. Another big little war starts. It's called World War II. And we all know that in World War II, the Holocaust happened. Now, you know our God's a merciful God and he's a loving God. And I'm sure it grieved him to see what people that were Christians, Germany was a Christian nation, what they were doing to his people, the Jewish people. But as God often does, what man thinks is evil, he turns to good. So I don't believe, this is my opinion, that there would be a Jewish state except for what the horrendous things they did to the Jews. It garnered a lot of sympathy for the Jewish people. So after the war, when they saw what the Germans had done, it really intensified the call for a Jewish homeland. The Jews in power that could influence governments, and many of the governments were very sympathetic at that time. It was the right time in history for the Jews to use what had been done to them, which was terrible, and we recognize it, in order to push for a place where they could call their own, where they could be safe. Because as you saw earlier, there were 750,000 in 1764, so almost 190 years later, there were probably more Jews in Poland and Russia and Ukraine, and we all know that there were 6 million Jews killed by the Germans. So this was a time that you say how terrible the Holocaust was, and we know it was, but God took what man used for evil, and he used that to bring the Jews back to their homeland.
Amen.
So there was an organization formed after World War II that was supposed to alleviate war and make the world a better place, and we call that the United Nations. So the United Nations comes in, and they pass a mandate to have a Jewish homeland. So in 1948, if you go to the Birth of Israel page, now if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, because this gets a little complicated. I went over with my wife, and we had to go over the colors and everything, because it changed quite a bit. On the left-hand side, you'll see a map. Now, all the blue is the proposed state of Israel, and all the yellow, whitish, it was the proposed Arab state. And Jerusalem was to be a city, a free city they called it, controlled by the United Nations. Both the Jews and the Arabs, the Muslims, declared Jerusalem a holy city. Yes?
Why would they put an Arab nation in the middle of Israel?
Good question. You look at it, I can tell, and I'm not a politician, and I'm not
That's crazy.
it's crazy. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You know that. It's like putting, you know the Hatfields and McCoys?
Yeah.
You're looking at this, that they're going to fight.
Terrible.
And they thought that the best would come out in people, but as most often comes, the worst comes out in people.
Is it still that way?
What's that?
Is it still like that?
No, it is not like that. If you look, well, let me just get ahead of myself. So in 1948, Israel declares themselves a nation. Soon as they did that, what happens?
With the war.
Arab nations come in. They come screaming in with tanks, and they were armies. The Jews did not really have an army. They were actually had little militias throughout the state. And an interesting fact is a lot of the Western countries didn't want to sell weapons to the Jews because they didn't want to, just like today, we don't want to would think giving them weapons is going to foster more fighting. They wanted a peaceful solution back then, and they said, well, if we give the Jews weapons, it's going to make the fighting worse. Even though the Arabs, Egypt had weapons, Jordan had weapons, Syria was now a country, they all had weapons. So they were all partitioned, and they came at us. So if you look at the picture on the right, so Jewish fights back. And another interesting fact, which I like interesting facts when I study history, is that when the Jews were looking for weapons, America was hesitant to sell, the French were hesitant to sell. But you know what? A lot of weapons that needed money, the Soviet Union. They'd just beaten Germany, their cities were trash. They had all these tanks sitting there, all these AK-47 sitting there, all these grenades, and they said, the only way we got these things to sell, we don't need them anymore. We just beat Germany. There's no enemies in our sight. We'll sell them. And the Jews came and said, we'll buy them. We'll pay top dollar. Jews had donors from all over the country, but they were smuggling these weapons in so the Jewish people could defend themselves against these armies. So we know the Lord's hand was upon this because 3 armies came cruising into Germany, into Israel, and through hook and crook, the Israelis were able to beat them and push them back. And now your map on the right, if you look, the Jewish state is a little bit bigger. So the blue and the light blue is what Israel took over. They pushed back the Jews, they pushed back the Arabs into Egypt. They pushed back the Jordanian army into the eastern side, and they pushed the Syrian army back up to the north. So you can see that after that, and they both the Jews and the Arabs looking at Jerusalem, which the UN said, Jerusalem's a free city, it's not going to be part of the thing. Well, the Jews said, we're taking it before the Arabs take it. The Arabs said, we're taking it before the Jews take it. So that didn't go anywhere. So the UN failed with keeping that a free city. So both that city was cut in half. The Jews were on one side, the Arabs went on the other half. Now you look at that part of the Arab part that has the cities of Jenin, Neablus, and Jericho in it. If you look at that on your map, what's that called today that's in the news a lot? It's called,
Gaza.
no, it's called the West what?
West Bank.
The West Bank.
Yeah.
That's what they refer to as the West Bank whenever you hear it. That blue line just to the right of Jericho, that's the Jordan River. Sorry. So that's the Jordan River. So that's there. So that was, on the other side of that was Jordan, and on the other side was the West Bank. At that point, it's still part of Jordan. So there were no, at that point, there were no Palestinians in the area. They weren't called Palestinians. The ones in the south were called Egyptians. They were part of what Egypt owned. The one in the middle of it was called Jordanians. To the north, they were either Lebanese or Syrians. But if you look here on the map, on the right side of the map, there's a little dot above Cain Yunis. And what's that little dot? What's the city called? Gaza. That little city there is Gaza. And as you notice,
They're fighting for it.
yep, right before.
Yeah.
As you notice that it's not taken over, Israel did not take that over during 1948. When they won, they didn't take that over. They pushed back. So they own all this land now. Their land is bigger after 1948 when they declared independence. So the Arabs realized that Israel's for real. They couldn't beat them when they had numerical superiority. They outnumbered them, I think, 5-1 in soldiers. They had more aircraft, more tanks. But what the Israels had was the help of the Lord. And also just, they had nothing to lose. If they lost, they would be killed. They would be wiped out just like as today. So then later on, the family drama continues. In 1964, there's still a lot of hostility between the Arabs and the Jews. In 1964, the PLO is formed. And it's formed because they had all these refugees that once Israel took over this area and they left. Israel told them they didn't have to leave. They could stay and be part of the new nation of Israel. Even though Israel is a theocracy, which it's governed by religious principles, it's also a democracy that there are I think 1/5 of their parliament, their Knesset it's called, is Arab. They have Arab political parties in Israel, and they said the Arabs do not have to leave, but they were encouraged to leave by the Arab nations around there, and they basically became refugees. And some of these places they set up, which were back then in the 50s, were refugee camps, are now really cities. The newspapers and stuff still call them refugee camps, but they're cities. There's buildings, there's skyscrapers, they're actual cities with millions of people now. You know, they've been 80 years, they've been called refugees, and most time refugees are not in a place for 80 years. They becomes their home. So the PLO was formed, and the term PLO stands for Palestine Liberation Organization. And that's when the first time that Palestine was mentioned as a people, representing a people. So all these refugees that were Arab Jordanian, Arab Egyptian, Arab Syrian, they became Palestinians. They became that name. They were not, everybody in Gaza was thought of as Egyptian, but at this point now you can see that Gaza is a little peninsular out in the middle of Egypt. It was called, they were called Palestinians. So in 1967, Israel gets attacked again. Well, actually, in 1967, the Arab nations were rattling swords. They were mobilizing their armies. They were saying they're going to take Israel. Egypt and Syria and Jordan was mobilizing. They had all these troops. They had all their planes lined up on the runways. And the Jews said, we're not waiting for them to attack. And the Jews attacked. And in 6 days, they wiped out every plane the Egyptians had. It was just a wonderful feat by the Israeli, so concise. And they took out all the enemies of Israel at that point. And they also took some more land that they took, but they had to do that in order to save their country. So that's where they were now, and in that war they took over that little place, that little area called the Gaza Strip. Israel occupied the Gaza Strip. Now at that point they were Palestinians. They called themselves Palestinians. So the Gaza Strip and the big West Bank are now called Palestine. PLO were in charge of both those. Even though the people are different from lineage, the Gazans were more Egyptian, from Egyptian descendants. The West Bank were more Jordanian. They had come from them. So that's where we were in 1967. So now Israel controls Gaza. So then in 1973, you have another war. Does anybody know what that war was called? It's named after a Jewish holiday called Yom Kippur War. The Arabs attacked when it was a Jewish holiday. And an interesting fact about that, and show you just how my father always said, don't mess with the Jews, because they had nothing to lose. Their back was against the war. They had a spy in Syria, and there's actually a Netflix, I think, show. It's called Spy. It was a Jewish man who they set him to South America. There's a big Arab presence in South America. Set him up with money. He became influential in the Arab circles. The Arabs invited him to Syria. He goes back to Syria. The Israelis are giving him money to flash around, and money talks wherever you go. And he became quite ingrained in the Syrian people. And the Syrian generals respected him, and he would lavish parties on him. And he became a favorite of the Syrians. Well, they took him on a tour of the hills where the Syrian artillery was. There's caves carved into the walls, and there's also natural caves. And this spy knows that not every cave had a Syrian artillery piece, but every one that did had a guard out front. So he said to the Syrians, he says, I'd like to do something. It feels sad that these guards are sitting out here in the hot sun. He says, I would like to donate a tree to put over these so your guards have shade. Well, the Syrians said, that's such a nice gesture. Sure, we'd like that. So he ordered, 150 trees. They delivered them, they planted them in front of every cave that had a Syrian artillery piece. So in 1973, when the war breaks out, the Jewish pilots know, aim for the caves with a tree in front. Isn't that clever?
Yeah.
So they basically, in one fell swoop, they didn't have to bomb any of the places that there weren't artillery pieces. And I thought that was pretty amazing when I watched that. He ended up actually getting caught, the spy, and tortured and then killed. But he's an honored person in Israel. So let's jump ahead now. It's 1987. And the PLO is the proxy. That means that they do the fighting for the Arabs. The Arabs know we're not going to go attack Israel straight up. We can't win. We haven't won 3 tries and we've struck out 3 times. So we have the PLO. So the PLO is down there by Gaza because Gaza is still part of Israel at this point. It's occupied by Israel. The West Bank is still occupied by Israel, but Israel's willing to give it up. And the PLO is created to represent the people, as I said earlier, and they're also the negotiating part of the Israel withdrawal. Israel give up land, give up settlements for peace. Israel has often said they will give up land for peace, and it's never worked out the way that we had hoped. But God is in control, so God knows. So it's 1987, and in the Gaza, a political party is formed out of the PLO. It's called Hamas. Hamas. Now, a lot of you don't know that the PLO is a political entity, and they have parties. And at that point, they had Hamas, which was mostly in Gaza, and they had Fatah, which was in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. So you have 2 political parties, and they're both vying for power. Then comes 2005, and Israel pulls out of Gaza. We're going to give you Gaza. We're pulling out. We're no longer in charge. They pull settlements down, which Israel's had set up. They call them kibbutzes, little villages, farms. They tell them they got to close them down, which wasn't very popular among the Israelites that lived there, but they pulled down. They went back into Israel proper, and they gave the country back to the PLO in Gaza. So what happens in Gaza now that they gave it back to them? Well, you have 2 political parties. They each have AK-47s, and what do? They have a war between themselves. They fight, and Hamas wins the war. They kill most of the Fatah that are in Gaza. The Fatah retreat to the West Bank, and Hamas becomes the winning political party and therefore the only political party in Gaza. So that's how we get Hamas in Gaza. Does anybody have any questions so far? I know this is a lot of stuff, and I'm throwing at you, but believe me, I could teach this every night for a week. The history from Abram to here.
I have a question.
Yes.
What is the historical hatred towards Jews?
Well, I think if you go back, that you saw that it was, first of all, it was a family problems. They were half brothers back in Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael. They were half brothers, and sometimes half brothers argue over this and that. I mean, back then it was a family. If you look at Abraham's family, it was probably the amount of people at some point in this room, and then you see that after generations, it became the Islam people, the Muslims, and the Jews.
Okay.
And I just think,
So one of the brothers became the Islamic people, and one of the brothers became the Jews.
yes, Ishmael became the Muslims, and Isaac was the father of the Jews. Abraham was the father of them both. So your grandfather was the father, and then he had 2 sons, and the 2 sons, they each wanted the land which God had promised to the Jews, but as you looked, the Arabs thought that they were the Arabs, the Muslims think they're the special people. They think Ishmael, the other brother, was the special person.
Yeah.
And of course they have the Quran, they don't have the Bible, and we believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. So that's just how, I don't know, everybody has a brother or sister in here, there's family squabbles, well this one's still going on 2,000 years later.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it just, and then, you know, God's chosen people, sometimes people don't like the favorite one. You know, they threw Joseph, his brothers threw Joseph into slavery because he was the favored son. It's gone on through history, and it goes on to families nowadays. Right, Gus? Right, John? So, and I put here a note, this would be like in our country between Hamas and Fatah, like the Democrats and Republicans. Like we know how contentious the politics are in this country right now. It's just like if one's getting ready to lose in a couple weeks now, and the other one says, well, if we're going to lose, we're going to kill. Thankfully, in this country, we don't have that. But in this area, they had that. One political party said, in order to win, we're going to just off, and they were all armed. You can see whenever there's an instance of anything in these Arab countries, what do? They run out in the street. It seems like everybody has an AK-47, and they just fire them into the ground. And, you know, Russia had sold a lot of them there, and they still funnel. There are people and countries with an invested effort to keep this country, keep this area chaotic. It gives other people's power. The PLO, a lot of these people want to keep fermenting anger at Israel and don't want peace process because it keeps them in control. They have power when there's chaos. So shortly after Hamas took over Gaza, both Israel and Egypt blockaded Gaza. Now, you would think that the Egyptians would be favorable to their PLO, their Palestinian cousins, but they didn't want anything to do with them either. They closed the border to Gaza. The Jews blockaded Gaza, and they both did it because the Palestinians are very radical. They're just very, their politics are very chaotic. The Egyptians were worried, we don't want that chaos coming into our country because it's going to upset us. And then even the Jordanians in the West Bank, they didn't want the Palestinians coming into their country because they actually have a monarchy there. And they said, well, the first thing they're going to do is try to topple our king and our queen. So they didn't want them coming in. So now you have Hamas in that area, and they fought excursions, which would be mini wars against Israel in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and the last one we heard of was 2023, when Hamas came across the border. There was actually an electric fence there that was monitored. They figured out how to jam the monitoring device. They jammed the monitoring device. They cut through the fence, and they were able to pour in before the Israelis could respond. And they had that massacre that we're still dealing with today. And then you look at the pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses of last spring. And it's full of many deceptions. Israel as a people have more claim to that land than any other nation on earth. Even if you take out that it was given, like Kurt said, God gave them that whole area there, and we already looked at God promised that to Abraham through Isaac, his descendants. Even if you took that out, there are no more Philistines, there are no more Kenites, no more Edomites, there are no more people, but there are Hebrews, the Jewish people that have been in that land as a central core. Even when they were dispersed all over, there were still hundreds of thousands of Jews in that land, and they lay claim to that land. There's no other nation really that I found that has the same people occupying the land thousands of years later, 2,100, 2,500 years later, as the Jews do to that claim. So when you hear the protesters saying that Israel is the colonizer, well, Israel has a right to that land. The same people that will say that Israel doesn't have the right to that land will say that the Indians have the right to the land in America because they were here before us. Well, the Jews were there before there were Palestinians. We saw Palestine didn't become a a people until 1964. So, and they say that Israel has occupied Gaza. Well, Israel left Gaza in 2005. And Gaza, instead of building a society and a civilization, they built an army. I read during the time the Netherlands donated pipe for irrigation, thousands of miles of pipe. And instead of building irrigation, Hamas built missile launchers. So they've had a lot of chances, but their hatred to Israel, which is satanic, is caused them not to take care of their people, but to take care of their desire to destroy Israel. They say that if Hamas would lay down their weapons, the war would end. If Israel was to lay down their weapons, they would be destroyed. They have a hatred for Jews. And I listened to a guy when this happened that one of the things that they teach their children in these countries to hate the Jews so much. We play at birthday parties pin the tail on the donkey. They actually play pin the tail on the Jew. They'll have a character of a Jew up there, and the children have a pin or something or other, and that's their game they play. It's radicalized into these people to hate the Jews. Yes.
When they're at war, is it capability, or I see the world always wanting Israel to practice restraint, which I don't get. What keeps them from just wiping them out?
Politics. You see now that when Hamas came across the border and killed 2,000 people, everyone said Israel has the right to defend themselves. And just imagine, like I said earlier, with New Jersey being a state, or just let's take Mexico and Texas. They're right next to each other, right?
Right.
If Mexicans came across the border, the cartel or whoever, and they killed 2,000 Americans, would America act with restraint? We would go in there and wipe them out. After 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan because they were where the Taliban were trained and being harbored. So they tell Israel to show restraint, and after Israel went in there, there's certain factions that supported with these deceptions that Palestine was the victim. The people that came across the border that perpetrated rape and slaughter are the victims, because that's how things can be manipulated. And they kept trying to pull, but the only way you get rid of terrorists and people like that, the only way we got rid of the Nazis was to defeat the Nazis. We didn't want to kill all the Germans, but we needed to defeat the Nazis in order to restore Germany to the civilized peoples. And the same thing with the Palestinians. Now, they have to finish the job, and they're almost done with the job down in Gaza, and that's the only way. And they're gonna occupy Gaza again. Yes, Kirk.
Yeah, it's just like in the Old Testament when Saul was king, God told him to go in there and wipe them people out, so they would no longer be a nation. But he didn't, and they're still suffering loss.
Right.
But in the Old Testament, a lot of them, God destroyed all of them. The Hittites, everyone you mentioned earlier, they're no longer there.
No.
They're gone.
But the Hebrews
And
are
that's what
there.
the Israelites got to do today to get rid of their enemies.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you leave there, if we would have stopped short and left Nazi Germany with a little, just stopped at the German border and say, okay, we're done, which is what basically happened in World War I. Even though we won, we didn't destroy the Nazis, the German structure as much as maybe we should have. History's a lot of parallel, different alternatives, but it allowed Hitler to rise, and then we had a bigger problem. So if you don't wipe out the cockroaches or the bed bugs, then you get more. So Israel says we have to destroy, and one of the things they just did, I don't know if anybody heard the news where Israeli put all those explosives in the beepers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the trees in front of the Syrian caves. Israel thinks ahead, because if they lose, they're done. They're not going to be a Jew left in Israel. When they say from the river to the sea, well, if you look at your map here, that blue line where it goes right through Jordan, that's the river. And the sea is the Mediterranean. So if you will be free, that's Israel. So they're not, it's a nice catchy phrase, you know, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, you say, oh wow, well, we want, you know, these college kids, they don't really know history. They say, well, that's great that Palestine will be free, but they don't realize that it's going to be free because to their language, the Palestinians, because there won't be a Jew left. So that's why Jews fight like they do. And you can look here, look between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean. I think that's like 40 miles. That's from here to not even North Jersey, from here to Cape May. That's Israel at its thinnest. So that's it's why Israel has to do it. So we know, as Christians, we know it through the Bible as what is to come. So hey, Kirk, would you read Matthew 24, 6-8 for me, please? Yeah, help him
I
out.
don't have my glasses.
Oh.
6 to 8, you said?
Yes, Matthew 24, 6-8.
And ye shall hear of wars and rumor of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows.
Yes, so we are in that, we know we're in that period of time. The rumors of war, and again, as throughout history, Israel's the focal point. That little piece of land is a focal point, and because it's God's promised land to the Jews, and it's just so central to the world history, and really no other place. You know, Japan, we had wars in Japan. Now that's a more quieter place. Germany's a quiet place, but what throughout history, they always meet right at that port between Asia and Europe, a little swath of land called Canaan, and then Palestine, and now Israel, Jordan, Syria, and even parts of Egypt. So my last note I had here to myself and to you all is, be not troubled, because God is in charge.
Amen.
So I hope this helped everybody understand. I know it's a lot of information. I hope I presented it well. If anybody has a question, this is Q&A time. I always wanted to say that. What?
No, I found it fascinating, the definition of Hamas in the biblical text was every like evil deed in the Hebrew tongue only has one definition, and it's called Hamas. The most horrific crimes you could think of, murder, rape, all, it has one word, Hamas.
Oh, okay.
That's what the word is.
Yeah, well, they're not shy about in their charter is the destruction of Israel. A lot of these countries, it's not negotiation with Israel. It's not live in peace with the Jews. It's destruction.
Oh yeah.
And they've bred that into their people. They've kept them in poverty. They've kept them unemployed. And when you have a bunch of young men who are unemployed, they got a lot of energy, and they're more than willing to sacrifice
They
themselves.
believe it's going to usher in their kingdom and set up their Messiah,
Yes,
their false Messiah.
yes. From Ishmael down to them, they believe that.
Global jihad, or
Yes,
whatever they call it.
yeah, jihad. What do they call a caliphate? They call it caliphate. All the Arab countries coming together, and they tried that a few times. In the 1973 war, Syria and Egypt were trying to join together to be an Arab nation. They figured they could become like the United States of Arab, and all these Arab countries would join. And there was just so much infighting, just like Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah.
You got two people who are brothers or cousins. They get together, and it doesn't always work. And it didn't work with Isaac and Ishmael, and it didn't work with Esau and Jacob, and it didn't work with Syria and Egypt. But we as a nation, America, and like I said in the beginning, will curse those. Let me just find it. And I will bless them that bless thee. So we have to really pray that America blesses Israel. We don't know in the book of Revelations where America fits in. It's not really mentioned. We don't know if America just fades from power and becomes quieter or isolationist. But we know that through this, that as long as America blesses Israel, we will be blessed. But if we start cursing Israel, which is a lot of Americans now, all those young young college educations. My wife and I went to, my son and his wife graduated college, and so many people walked across that stage and unfurled Palestinian flags, shouted Palestinian slogans. They're being deceived. And we have to pray for them because they're young and they got a lot of energy, and but they're not being told the truth. And the truth is that Israel was in the land, still in the land. There's no other people. The Palestinians were not a people till they were fabricated in 1967, 1964. And that land is God gave that land to Israel, to the Jews. And the Jewish people will live in harmony with the Arabs. They've already said that. And there's many Arabs that live and work in Israel, but it's not the other way around. I saw it, and at the UN, one of the Israel speaker got up and he was saying about how many Arabs there were living in Israel, and he went to all the Arab countries. Morocco, how many Jews are there in Morocco? In the 40s there were 200,000 Jews in Morocco. Now there's none. He went to the Iraqi. How many Jews back in the 60s? There were 200,000. Now there's none. Iran, now there's none. Syria, now there's none. All these countries in that area, they push the Jews out either by just forcing them out or killing them. So they're not a peaceful people, and we as a nation and we as Christians have to pray for Israel and pray that our nation supports them and continues to support them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.